How did crypto bros become such a powerful political force?
They should not be subject to the same regulation as banks.
Why is the right considered today's counterculture?
They're all way better than this!
When did clean energy become too lip-coated?
Confront the climate crisis.
Just some of the stuff we explore in the Culture Lab, the marvelous mad science of how the zeitgeist shapes our politics. Hosted by data scientists and pollsters, Kyla Van Ellenfitch and Gabe DeRoche. Join every week as they bring together data, their own insights, and a special guest to put a different loaded question under the microscope. Culture Lab, a brand new podcast from Air Quotes Media, creators of Curse of Politics, The Herle Burly, and Hotel Pacifico. Subscribe now.
All right, greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. We have a special show today. If you're any kind of regular listener to either this podcast or Curse of Politics, you know my brilliant friend and mentor, Elly Alboim, passed away almost 2 weeks ago. To précis a remarkably accomplished professional life, Elly was a journalist for the CBC for almost a quarter century, before becoming Parliamentary Bureau Chief for TV News and National Political Editor. He was a senior policy and strategy advisor to Paul Martin and Kathleen Wynne and others, a longtime educator in journalism at Carleton and Queen's, and principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. I want to remember Elly's life and work today, the kind of man he was, his influence on people, on the country, and beyond. With me to do that are three friends and colleagues who worked with him, sparred with him, learned from him, loved him. Peter Mansbridge, Keith Boag, Peter Nicholson. Two titans of the CBC and an economist and head of policy, Herle Burly alumni, all of them. Let me tell you a little bit about these three gentlemen. First of all, Peter Nicholson has been chief economist to a major bank in Canada. He's been head of strategy for a major corporation in this country. He's been the head of the Canadian Academies of Science, and he was a core intellectual part of Liberal and Paul Martin economic policy in the mid-1990s. Keith Boag is one of the most accomplished journalists the country has ever produced, Ottawa Bureau Chief for CBC, Washington Bureau Chief for CBC, and reporter from all over the world, one of the great journalists of our time. And then Peter Mansbridge needs obviously no introduction to anybody, but I just want to say that we're going to talk about mentoring on this show and Elly's role as a mentor. And Peter Mansbridge doesn't need any lessons on that, really, because from my perspective, he pulled me off of the scrap heap of Canadian politics in 2008 and put me on the national and created a second career and a second act for me, for which I am eternally grateful. So thank all three of you for making the time to be this. You're all incredibly accomplished and busy people, and I know that you're doing this not for me, but for Elly. So thanks for doing it. Let's start with, because he's such an unusual person, Mansbridge, tell me about the first time you met him. Do you remember the first time you met him?
I do. It was probably 1977. Yeah, I'd heard about Elly before. He'd been in Montreal in the local news covering, as the assignment editor, and he even did a few reports himself. I was in Ottawa. I just moved to Ottawa the year before from Saskatchewan. You know that place, David.
I do.
And I'd been the national reporter in Saskatchewan, and they were trying to build up the Ottawa Bureau with new kind of young guys. So I went in there. Mark Phillips came in from Montreal. Mark Phillips, who then made a great career at CBS. John Blackstone, another guy who went to CBS. We were three of the kind of young cohort in there in the Ottawa Bureau. But it was, in many ways, we were there for a good time, not a long time. And we needed somebody in there to kind of, hold the whip to us. And that's when Elly came in. He'd been in Montreal and then in Toronto as the national assignment editor. And he came to Ottawa, which had always been his big dream, to cover national politics. He understood national politics, but he'd never been there. So he didn't know anybody. He arrived in Ottawa, he knew not a soul. And, people like Blackstone, Phillips, and I were more concerned about it. Was he going to sort of make us work a lot harder than we had already. We were there, as I said, having a good time because it was fun to cover national politics. But Elly wanted a tougher stance from his bureau, and so he got us going right away. But he didn't know anyone. He literally didn't know anybody in Ottawa, and we all did. So we introduced him to people. And I'd say within 6 months, he was introducing us to people because he had this amazing ability to understand people, to learn from people, and to meet people. And it was his way of covering that city in a way it had never been covered before by the CBC for certain. And he set up years of great coverage as a result of that. But when he came, we were a little bit anxious because we thought he was going to curtail the good time we were having. He never did that. We still had a good time, but he taught us all kinds of things about understanding journalism and understanding politics.
Although the furthest thing from a partier or even being good at small talk himself, like he would have met Ottawa in a different way than you might have.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, the kind of people we knew were not the kind of people Elly wanted to know. He wanted to know people like Nicholson. You know? We were interested in who was holding the party that night.
Exactly.
And sometimes those two things work together to tell the story of what happened to the nation's capital. But he was not the king of small talk.
That's for sure. This week, we want to pause to remember and honor the lives lost in the horrific tragedy at Tumbler Ridge. It's in moments like these that what's really important snaps into focus, and the rest falls to the wayside. Nothing can help make sense of the tragedy, and there is no way to adequately express the sympathy we all feel for every family impacted and the entire community of Tumbler Ridge. For a moment, that grief unites us all across BC, Canada, and even around the world. From all of us here at Air Quotes Media and presenting sponsor TELUS, we offer the only thing one can at such a time: a moment of silence to remember the lives lost and honor the families and community left shattered dealing with the aftermath. Please hug your children, friends, family, and neighbors a little tighter, and keep all those impacted in your thoughts. The TELUS Health Crisis Support Line has been activated in Canada and is available to anyone. Call 1-844-751-2133 for free professional emotional support and or referral to community resources. Peter Nicholson.
Yep.
Did you first meet him at a CMO, or had you met him before a CMO?
No,
Do we have to explain what a CMO is?
Yes, I will explain what a CMO is. No, I remember vividly the first time I laid eyes on, or as I like to put it, the first time I experienced Elly Alboim, and it was quite an experience, and of course it had been ever since. No, it was in early April of 1994, and I was sort of freshly minted as a position in the Department of Finance called the Clifford Clark Visiting Economist, and I had come over there from the Bank of Nova Scotia because I knew Paul Martin and I knew David Dodge, and it was through that connection. At that time, there were regular meetings with the minister, the deputy, a bunch of officials, and around a great big table. And it was called a CMO, and as I recall it, that stood for Cohen, Minister, and Others. And it was a
a holdover from Mickey Cohen, and a symbol of where Mickey thought that he and ministers resided.
Yes, and it was kind of a show and tell, and it was totally freewheeling, quite a Donnybrook. Mind you, Elly's position in that became clear and was the same ever since, and that is as the wise person sitting at one end of the table who never said a word until 2 or 3 hours after the debate we thought had subsided and conditions we thought or decisions we thought had been made. And then Ellie, with one sentence, would, of course, disassemble everything that had been discussed in the last 2 or 3 hours. I was just gobsmacked by this guy right from the very first moment. And we can get back on that. Of course, there's lots more to say about the characteristics that so impressed me then and have really to this sad day, essentially, that we no longer have him.
What was it that he would say in at the end of that discussion that got your attention?
I think it was usually yes, but, and have you considered? And he had the skill that probably the best lawyers have too. They instinctively go to the weakest link in your chain of argument. And it didn't matter how much you thought you had figured out every possible angle.
Yeah.
Ellie always found an angle that you hadn't thought of. And he not only found it, it was usually destructive of the position that you were trying to put forward.
Right. Yeah. Keith, you're a little younger. When did you encounter Ellie?
Oh, I think I was part of summer camp at the National when I was a reporter in Fredericton. I got brought into Toronto to do some reporting for the National, and one day I had to do something on politics, and I didn't know exactly some little point, and somebody said, call Ellie, and I said, okay, what's her number? And that's when I first found out about Ellie and his story and the legend that I was about to get on the phone. But can I just say something that I think is important to anchor this in the minds of people who don't know really who we're talking about? Because Ellie's never really been on TV. He's never had a byline. But his stature in this community was something that I don't think we see in this country. If this were the United States, he'd be Ben Bradley. Not because of his temperament and his personality, but because of his demanding nature, his integrity, the way he was able to make really sound decisions at really critical moments and stick by them and stick by his people. The influence he had in the journalistic community was way beyond any other journalist who was not on the air without a byline.
Mm.
It was an extraordinary thing. It's the reason we're here. And if I might add to what Peter Nicholson said, I'm going to assume that Peter Nicholson enjoyed talking to Ellie, because my feeling was that the reason that so many people returned Ellie's phone calls, and I'm talking about, senior bureaucrats, people in the Prime Minister's office, PCO, I think they were hungry to talk to Ellie because he was a great source for them. He liked to gossip. He also knew what he was talking about.
We joined Earnscliffe together, Keith. We joined Earnscliffe at the same time. And I used to, he lived way out in the east end of Ottawa somewhere in a townhouse, nothing very impressive. And I used to drive him home because he would take the bus in to work.
Sure.
And I used to drive him home just so I could have the opportunity to talk to him, because it was so exhilarating. I had never experienced anything like that before when I first met him. And I thought, fuck, I am going to be way smarter than everybody else tomorrow because I got to drive Elly Alboim home. So.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about, though. And I experienced that myself when I went into his office. If I could have a little of Ellie's time, I would be, 10 or 15 times smarter than I was by the time I left, which is a sliding scale, I understand. But I think that a lot of the people who he needed to talk to really so enjoyed talking to him that they put his returned Ellie's phone call right at the top of the pile of their list. And I think that helped him to do his job. But it established the relationship, or the reputation rather. It established the reputation that he has now. He was somebody who spoke the language of the people he was talking to, and they knew as soon as he got on the phone with them, or they with him, that he respected what they were doing and had taken the time to understand it and understood their time was valuable too. I will put in the time. And he taught that to us. Don't get on the phone with somebody and ask them to explain it all to you. Know something.
So this week, a fellow named Mark Wiseman will report to work in Washington, D.C. As Canada's new ambassador, he will occupy our spectacular embassy on Pennsylvania Avenue, widely regarded as the most coveted diplomatic site in the city. The location was delivered by President Ronald Reagan to his close friend, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, back in the 80s. The building, by architect Arthur Erickson, was designed to represent a bolder, more stylish, more confident Canada. It was inaugurated in 1989, around the same time as the original Free Trade Agreement took effect, integrating and enriching the economies of both countries. In the decades since, Canada and the US have enjoyed deep prosperity. The border has been relatively seamless. About $3.6 billion in goods and services crosses it daily, and our sponsor, CN, carries a great deal of the cargo. 2026, though, is not 1989. Ambassador Wiseman has his work cut out. Canada and the United States have until July 1st to endorse and renew the Canada-US-Mexico Trade Agreement, the grandchild of the original agreement. It's just about impossible to overstate the importance of that mission. The continuation of smooth, unhindered trade is quite simply in everyone's interest. Ambassador Wiseman arrives in the footsteps of impressive predecessors, the likes of Vincent Massey, Lester Pearson, Edgar Ritchie, whose son Gordon, by the way, would decades later negotiate the first free trade agreement, Alan Gottlieb, Michael Wilson, Frank McKenna, and the first woman ambassador, Kirsten Hillman, who did a remarkable job and is now departing. Canada has been well served in Washington. CN sincerely thanks Ambassador Hillman for her great work and wishes Canada's new envoy, Mr. Wiseman, success. Yeah, so Peter Mansbridge, what did he? One of the things he was renowned for as an advisor in the role that Nicholson and I know him, it was truth to power. How did that manifest? So, he would just say directly to you what he believed in a way that wasn't offensive, but could be very jarring. And how did that manifest itself in journalism when he was working with somebody like you?
Usually it manifested itself by him looking at your script and saying, "You don't have it there. That's not the story." And you've got to get the story because you're treading water here in what you've written. So we've got to find out what the real story is. And he wouldn't just sort of tell you that and then leave. He would work with you on trying to determine it. I do love these anecdotes that you all have of how people love to talk to him. I've got to remind you, it wasn't like that at the beginning. He had nothing to offer because he knew nobody and he didn't know the stories.
Right.
But he very quickly positioned himself to talk to the people, know the people, and trust the people who could help him with that. And he very quickly advanced beyond where the rest of us were. So it became for us too this wonderful moment of sitting, talking to him, usually in the mornings. And we had a kind of varied bunch. I mentioned, Phillips and Blackstone, but Duffy was there. Ken Colby was there.
Brian Stewart.
Some of you may remember from way back. David Haltman. We'd sit there. It was all men then. We're talking the 70s. There was not a woman in the bureau other than the one who answered the phones at the front desk. It was a terrible situation in far as diversity goes. But the meetings in the morning were ones that were, helped mold minds in terms of how we covered politics, what the questions we needed to ask, and what we were trying to get out of it all. That there was no point in putting an item on the air that night that didn't really advance the story and bring Canadians into the fold of understanding what that story was about. He wasn't the greatest visual guy in terms of television. That wasn't one of his check marks. Many of us did have those skills, but we didn't know what the basis of the story was. That's where Ellie took us and taught us in such a fashion that made us all better journalists. So I think that was one of the many things that he offered us, was that morning session of talks as a group to try and understand stories, and then as individuals when you're working on that story. Keith will be even better at this part of it than I, but one of the most fabulous times working with Ellie was always around an election, because election nights are a product of what you've done in the kind of 4 nights previous in effect rehearsing possible election outcomes. And you'd have long sessions that Ellie would kind of chair, where you talk about the possibilities that election could have, and breaking it down through regions, through provinces, through people, through leaders. In all of those conversations, they were like books in themselves about the coverage of politics. So just an amazing guy, and the way you've got to appreciate that before he got to that Ottawa bureau, it wasn't anything like that at all.
Well, let's pick up from there. Maybe Peter, you and Keith can talk a little bit about how he changed the CBC News and its coverage when he rose to that level.
Well, I think one thing that's important to note, and this was not my time, or put it another way, what was Ellie's time, I caught the tail end of, and Peter was there at the beginning. And it was essentially the 1980s. And what was considered, I think, to be the most important story of our time was the patriation of the Constitution, the election of a separatist government in Quebec, the attempted reconciliation with Quebec, and the failure of the Meech-Lake Accord. That's all one story, right? And it goes on beyond that.
Yep.
But it was also the first time a lot of these kinds of things had been seen on television. A story of that importance in the early 1980s, patriating the Constitution, rewriting parts of it, entrenching a Charter of Rights, all of those things were stories that were profoundly important for the country. And the CBC had a really special responsibility about how that story was told.
Can you just take a second, Keith, and remind people what the reach and audience of the CBC would have been in those days?
Peter would be better at that than I, because I think sometimes those numbers get disputed, but I will put it this way. That was during the period when the National was referred to as appointment viewing. I'm not going to say everybody in the country watched it, but all the players in the country watched it. It had a sizable audience, and people wrote about it. And if we made a mistake, everybody knew about it. But the media and a class of elites understood that we have a public broadcaster to perform in a certain way at a moment like this. We're making history here. You better do it right. And a lot of that burden fell on Ellie's shoulders to guide the CBC through its coverage of a seminal moment in Canadian history. That's an exciting time. And I mean, I was just fresh out of school when the patriation of the Constitution was happening on TV. And I remember the night of the Long Knives and the night that deal was made, turning on the TV, and the National led with what I believe, and Peter will know exactly, was an 18-minute story about how that deal came together. The footage for that story alone formed a big part of the National Film Board's archives and its longer versions of the story. But I mean, Peter did that story, and I remember thinking, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do in my career. I was just starting out, but I was mesmerized by it. I just wondered, like, how the hell did they do that? Peter, you must have something to say about that story, because I'll bet it's one of those that you will always remember.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. That was just before the Journal started. There was 1981/82, somewhere in there. But it was at the end of the week.
Right, it was Friday. Yeah.
And we decided early that morning that we knew enough things that hadn't been reported. And that's always the best stuff, stuff you can't get into your story, your minute-and-a-half story.
Yeah.
We knew a lot of little things that had happened, Blakeney meeting Davis at Mama Teresa's, over a cannelloni or something, and where their part of the deal came together. Hatfield off at some bar in the Chateau Laurier and things that he was doing. But anyway, what happened?
You're just going to leave it at that, are you, Peter?
I mean, what happened was early in the morning, we said, we got a lot of this stuff, and we know it as golden. So we're going to put it together. So I started writing, and Ellie was in the edit suite. To do I can't remember exactly how long it was, but it was, Keith, is right. It was somewhere in the teens.
It was an extraordinary thing to see on a national newscast.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of journalism.
Very much so. I don't think that anything had ever been longer than 3 or 4 minutes on the national. And suddenly we're dealing with something that was 13, 14, 15 minutes long. I remember that day very well, because I hadn't actually been feeling very well that day, and I had the typewriter with me in the washroom of the 8th floor of the CBC building, on the National Press building.
Been doing some research.
I was typing and passing the scripts over the top of the wall to Ellie, who would rush in and work with the editor on getting the appropriate pictures to make it all work. Anyway, it was an amazing thing, and I can remember Peter Herndorf watching it, and he was the vice president of the CBC at the time, the late great Peter Herndorf,
Great man,
who watched that, and he said, "That's what the journal has to do.
Yeah.
When the journal starts, they've got to be doing stuff like this." Of course,
no one understood.
No. The news department will do it. Don't give it to those guys at the journal. But anyway, we worked to compromise on that. But Ellie was central to that. He kind of cataloged it all. He said, "Okay, that's really good. That's important. That tells us this and why this part of it worked. So you've got to incorporate that into the script." So it was quite a day. I'm glad you mentioned it, Keith, because I'd pretty much forgotten that. And that was a moment. That was a classic Ellie moment where he took control, said, "That's a great idea. Now we got to make it happen. We got to make it happen in a matter of hours."
I think it included that iconic scene of Chrétien and Roy Romano and I don't know who else, McMurtry. McMurtry in the kitchen.
Yeah, that was Duffy got that.
Yeah.
For all the things they said about Duffy, he had an amazing run of stories.
Yeah.
Especially through the late 70s and early 80s, and that was one of them. He got that, the kitchen cabinet or whatever they called them.
Yes, that's right.
Together that part of the deal.
But I think it's fair for me to say that doesn't happen without Ellie.
Ontario's need for clean, dependable energy is growing, and meeting that demand calls for bold action. The Bruce C project would add up to 4,800 megawatts to its existing site, making Bruce Power the largest nuclear generator in the world, with a total capacity of 12,000 megawatts. But this isn't just about energy security. It's about jobs, innovation, and prosperity. The project is expected to create and support about 20,000 jobs annually during design and construction, and thousands more for decades, contributing billions to Canada's economy. Learn how Bruce Power is building a stronger, cleaner future at brucepower.com. When Ellie came into Earnscliffe and started getting exposed to the federal government, one of the things he said to me in sadness was that a lot of what he had thought was strategy was just shit happening. That government was a lot less impressive than he thought it was. That it was more random than he thought. So how would you describe him? Was he cynical, or was he, because he had a certain cynicism about him, but he's also a deeply moral person. I'm kind of interested in how you describe him.
Who are you asking here?
I wouldn't say he was cynical. There were those he chose to believe and believe in, whether they were journalists or politicians. If he was in any way cynical, it was dismissing those he didn't feel fitted that mold.
Right.
And he didn't spend time worrying about them or dealing with them. But he didn't like politicians who he thought were lying to him or trying to use us, and he'd swing back fairly quickly at that kind of thing.
I think he understood fundamentally that cynicism is a kind of laziness, and he had an eye for it, but in other people.
Yeah.
But he could be tremendously funny, right? And sometimes in summing up people's people's character. And I remember once when we were covering a trial that overlapped with something that it was related to the budget leak, and somebody they had either lied or the PMO had gone beyond. But the PMO had essentially exposed its relationship with the RCMP by tipping us off to when they were going to arrest somebody, right? And I think Ellie said something like, "They may be sleazebags, but there are sources."
There may be sleazebags, but there are sleazebags.
Yeah, and I think that perfectly captured how he approached each and every day. That he was going to meet a variety of sources, and he'd enjoy some of them, and others not so much.
Yeah.
But that was the job.
Yeah.
Hey,
Nicholson,
let me just back up
go ahead, Peter.
one quick second here, David, because Keith mentioned something that's really important. Through that period of whether it was Meach or Charlottetown or the Patriation earlier, he really understood and appreciated and recognized the importance of what a public broadcaster can be and should be, especially through a time of, a degree of national crisis. He thought that was important. He understood it better than some of his bosses at the executive level of the CBC understood, which created all kinds of tension in there. Ellie was always up for a fight, and he had a lot of them internally at the CBC.
Yeah.
And he took the case for public broadcasting. He took the case for his journalists and defended them to the hilt. And we'd both been there, Keith and I, knowing what that can be like and how important it is to have somebody like that in there. But the really important part was he understood and respected public broadcasting.
So interesting, Peter. What did he think it was?
Well, in the case of the CBC, it's pretty simple, really. It is there to reflect the country to itself through all its ups and downs, through all its diverse nature, and to find the way of telling the story, whatever that story happened to be, in a way that could be understood and accepted through all the different parts of the country. Now, it didn't always work. It snapped back. We had, resistance on things like Meach about the CBC saying they were in the pocket of the government of the day, which was not the case. But you were working sources who were in the government of the day, in the governments of the day, through the provinces. We had as many good sources at the provincial level as we did at the federal level. But understanding that and understanding what the CBC is there for and why, the news and current affairs segment of the CBC is more important than any other part of the CBC. And that management has to understand there are times when that priority should take place. And that's why he fought for, all-day coverage of constitutional matters and succeeded in that. Now, that was a different era. That was before News Network came along, and there was only one television vehicle for CBC. We kind of owned the space, and a lot of that was because of Ellie.
Did you know, Herle Burly-ites, that 2/3 of Canadians have investments? Of those investors, 61% hold mutual funds and 24% hold ETFs. So chances are many of you listening right now know this to be true. You get a lot of mail. And that's because securities law still says paper is the default way to communicate with you. According to today's sponsor Fidelity Investment Canada's research, it is estimated that the industry prints 900 tons of paper annually to satisfy a paper-first rule. For listeners visualizing what 900 tons could look like, that's 57 CN towers stacked on top of one another. However, Polera Public Opinion Research shows that when told of the environmental impact of paper, 88% of mutual fund investors and 89% of ETF investors say they prefer to receive their personal statements digitally. Millions are spent on paper that is wasted, and the environment takes a hit as a result. However, the fix can be straightforward. new policy that ensures that electronic delivery is the default, with the option to have paper for those who want and need it. Modern, efficient, better customer service, better for the planet. Tune in next time for more insights on the effects a paper-first approach has on investors across Canada. So, Keith, I saw a little tribute documentary that I think you were involved in making for Ellie when he left the CBC.
Yeah.
And in there is a guy that worked at the Montreal local CBC station, talking about how when Ellie was in charge of the lineup at the local in Montreal, it was all international news. And he was not interested in covering the local fire or the crime or anything like that. They were leading with story after story about international news, and their ratings were in the absolute tank. And he did not seem to care about that. As you're talking about the focus on Meach and the Constitution, and I'm aware of where that rests in Canadians' Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where did the search for ratings come in, or relevance, popular relevance, when Ellie was running the national desk?
Well, he thought there were things that a CBC, that a public broadcaster absolutely had a responsibility to do, regardless of how that affected the ratings. He also thought the CBC was doing things that it shouldn't be doing. Like he didn't like hockey on TV. He's a hockey fan, but he didn't think that hockey needed the CBC, right? That we don't have a public broadcaster to put on a sporting event that somebody else would put on if we weren't going to do it. And hockey, amazingly, has survived not being on CBC in the way they used to be, right? But he would be quite adamant about making that case too when he was outlining his vision of what a public broadcaster was. To get back to your original question, what did he think it was? He thought it was the railroad, right? I mean that in a metaphorical sense, that he thought CBC in the 20th century was the railroad in the 19th century, that it was
Right.
it was a way for Canada to understand itself and to bring itself together. But he, I think you or Peter mentioned, how excited he'd get about elections. That was also, I think, when he really demonstrated how deeply he thought about the role, not just of public broadcasting, but of journalism in Canada. And it's where I learned some fundamentals that stuck with me through my whole career as bureau chief, as chief political correspondent. Things like, when I was chief political correspondent, Ellie was not with CBC anymore, but I remembered what he had said at the time. If you're covering a debate, when you come out of the debate and it's over, don't you tell anybody who won. You don't know who won. You live in your bubble and you have your ideas and your standards and a news agenda kind of way of covering it. The Canadian public may have a completely different way and react to it in a completely different way, and they may vote in a completely different way from what you could possibly anticipate from your perch. Well, that's become kind of standard fare now after the election of Donald Trump. Legacy media sort of understands that. It lives in a bubble now. But Ellie was saying those kinds of things when they weren't popular in the press gallery at all, because the press gallery kind of took on this idea of itself as shaping people's thoughts all of the time. And some of the times that's true. But in that particular instance, in a debate scenario or an election generally, Ellie was very adamant. This is not your moment to make judgments at all. This is a moment for the people to decide. And at certain times, your job is to facilitate that conversation and stay out of it.
Right. All right. One last thing on the CBC before we move on to the post-CBC career. Both Peter and Keith, and Peter go first, and then I want to hear from both of you, did live events with, whether it's elections or whether it's conventions or any number of other different. What was that like, and what kind of teamwork was involved? Just give us a little behind the scenes glimpse of, Peter, of how you and Ellie would work together on a live event.
Yeah, sure. First of all, just on ratings, thinking that maybe Meach and that kind of stuff didn't get ratings. They got huge ratings.
Oh, yeah?
Like huge ratings. That week that led to the Meach deal,
yeah,
the numbers were like through the roof, and we were on the air a lot, not just on the national, but whenever something significant would happen, we'd burst on the air.
Yeah,
and we literally had millions watching. There was kind of that, then 9/11, and few other times where we had those kind of huge numbers. What was it like on election nights? For me, I was sitting, at times with Keith when he was the chief political correspondent. I have a thing in my ear all the time. It's kind of like you there. I know your staff is always telling you, David, what to ask, and they're whispering to you probably right now.
Yeah.
But what Elly would do was if he saw something happening in a riding or a region that might be the beginning of a trend, he'd whisper it to you, say, you got to watch, be careful about what's happening there. This may be something. So there was that. And then the closer you got to an outcome, he was pushing you. Start pushing your language and your comments towards, a conservative majority in the Mulroney days, or a conservative win, or a liberal. There's something happening out there. They're going to wipe out the Conservative Party in '93. He would start to edge you in that direction based on what he could see, looking at the numbers and the results that were coming in. But the big offering from Elly around election times were those meetings that I talked to you about before we went to air. He was amazing in those. He gave you lots of things to be thinking about. And as a result, he gave you some of the lines you'd end up using on the air because he was already pointing in those directions based on his knowledge and what he'd seen and learned from others.
Right. Keith, I'd like you to answer the same question, but I just want to know if you ever found Elly frustrating, because I did, because Elly would regularly stop me from doing things I wanted to do, or stop me from saying things I wanted to say. And I would not do them because I knew that Elly was right, but it would bug me.
I think that speaks to possibly a difference in our personalities, Dave. When I came, I wasn't like Peter coming and working through it and showing Elly stuff. I never showed Elly anything. Elly knew a ton more by the time I got to him than as Peter has already said. So I was very careful. If I don't think I can't remember questioning him more than once or twice. And usually when I was absolutely sure that I had read something or understood something in a reasonable way. But what he does, and I think everybody experiences this with Elly, is that he brings an instant clarity to a question. He frames it or reframes it in a way that suddenly you see the dimensions of it absolutely clearly. And I can remember feeling like, okay, now shut up. I need to process that. It's all new to me seeing it that way. And that's a great, great feeling. That's when you feel yourself growing in your understanding of the story. But, when we were on election campaigns, especially I was on the plane in '88 and '93. And we connected with Elly through these nightly notes where he would tell us what was going on in the campaign from his office. Well, I guess he would be in Toronto for those things, but he just knew more about what was going on than anybody on the road or covering it. And he used to kind of brag about that, saying that him being able to contact all the campaigns every day and talk to him gave him a much more textured and dynamic understanding of the campaign than you can get on the plane. And can I just tell you one story, because I think it reflects on the kindness of Elly a little bit. My first campaign was '88, and everybody has a certain story about the '88 campaign in free trade. But there was one story in the '88 campaign that affected the Liberal campaign directly and dramatically.
Well, no fucking kidding.
This is the story that Peter did on how some in the party had tried to replace the leader, John Turner, in the middle of the campaign with Jean Chrétien. And I didn't know this story was coming. I had not a hint of it, and I was there on the plane with them when that story broke. So there I was, a new guy on the plane, which means none of the other reporters know me very well at all at this point, but they sure as hell hate my guts because I am with the CBC, and that story has got to be wrong because I didn't have it. right? And I didn't know any of the work that had gone into it. I had seen the story and I'd got a note from Ellie briefing me on it. And so I was defending the CBC on the plane. And of course, at the front of the plane, they had a different understanding of the truth of that story. In other words, they knew it was true. At the back of the plane, I was explaining, like, we don't put Peter Mansbridge on the air as a reporter because we're uncertain of the details, or that we don't want, and all this stuff. But anyway, after all of that's done, and we managed to drag some people out from the party and I think we had some kind of a conference about it just to get them to confess that it was all true. But after that, and for years, whenever that story came up, Ellie would say how terrible he felt for me, knowing that I was on my first campaign and what I was going through.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is very sweet, because he and I fought about that story many times too, and he never said he felt badly for me. So Nicholson, let's yank you back into this. Do you recognize the person that they've been describing?
I do. I recognize him so remarkably. It's really it's amazing that in the context that I knew him in, which was very different from the one we've just been discussing, everything that has been said about Ellie is what I saw about Ellie. I would say one thing, bringing back this notion of was he a cynic or not. I guess I would define a cynic as a disappointed idealist, and by that standard, perhaps he was, but he was also more than enough of a realist that whatever cynicism came from his disappointed idealist character, he was more than able to control. But no, look, the description that Peter and Keith have given of Ellie was exactly the Ellie that I knew, and he was just so remarkably consistent. What you saw was always what you got. He never varied. The wisdom was always there, the calm demeanor. Well, we can go on. Yeah.
So you saw him for a year involved with Paul, and then you went off to the rest of your career, and you hired him to help you in those other places. So what had you seen in his advice that made you want more of it?
Well, exactly. That's the great question. I certainly hired him, but I also recommended him to a number of people who were looking for the best advisor that in this country. And I always would say, well, there's one name head and shoulders above all the others. But I've got to warn you, before you hire this man, that you're going to have to be prepared for some cold showers. And I always come back to a particular phrase that I think sums Ellie up, at least in my experience, better than any other. And that was, he always tells you not what you want to hear, but what you need to hear. And that was his sterling characteristic as an advisor. But he had more than that, obviously. He had tremendous penetrating insight, and we've seen in the stories of Peter and Keith examples of that. I could only describe it as a sixth sense. I mean, you couldn't just by logical analysis come to the points that Ellie came to instinctively. So he brought that to any discussion. His integrity.
He was super fast, eh? Like, I used to sit there and I would go, if I had had enough time, I could have come up with that too.
And you always would say afterwards, "Oh my God, why I should have thought of that." But that's the characteristic of great advice, and that was combined with this almost unprecedented degree of integrity and honesty, and that, of course, was part of why he always told you what you needed to hear, not just what you wanted to hear. The other thing about Ellie is that his ego was always completely under control. And that's something that can't be said for a lot of high-priced political and management consultants, obviously. So as an advisor, I've never seen anyone that could come close. And I never had any hesitation to suggest that to many others that they hire him, but always with the caveat that you've got to be prepared for some cold showers and you've got to be prepared to be told what you need to hear.
There were lots of politicians that only met with him a few times and didn't like it because he would just directly tell them what was wrong with what they were thinking about doing. And some people don't like that. Tell me a little bit about what you think the magic was between him and Paul Martin. I mean, Paul Martin's a man of great enthusiasms, right? What was the role? What role did Ellie play in that mix?
Well, I mean, you've almost answered the question in the way you framed it, because Paul needed some governance, and Ellie certainly was capable, as you say, of putting a little cold water on your enthusiasms. But Paul obviously respected his intellect, and Paul recognized that he was in the presence of a political advisor who filled a lot of the gaps in Paul's own political intuition, which frankly wasn't his strongest point. But he could see that in Ellie, and I think it's it's to Paul Martin's credit that he was able to submerge his own ego and accept advice from Ellie, which he badly needed on many occasions.
Right.
Yeah.
Since we've talked about this directness, almost abruptness, some people say gruffness. I want all three of you to talk a little bit about how it was leavened by who he was. Like somehow he could say things that were the opposite of what I wanted to hear, but I would know that they was said with the best of intentions. I would know that he was trying to make me successful. It wasn't a criticism. It wasn't a put down. It was somehow done, even though it was done very directly, it was done very constructively. I'm searching for words here, but I think you probably know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. That was the feeling I always had about Ellie from the very first moment when I was seeing him sort of across the table, not interacting with me, but with the others who were sitting around, all these large egos. And I mean, in my case, I could just see the logic and the wisdom and the insight in what he was saying, and the fact that it was said without ego. I mean, in no way could I ever interpret it as a put down. I just interpreted it as pure wisdom, brilliant instinct, telling me exactly what I needed to hear.
Yeah. Keith, Peter, anything you'd say about that?
I agree with everything that my fellow Peter just said in terms of, how direct he could be with his criticism, and left a few people speechless as a result, journalists and politicians. And fearing him. I was lucky because I had a different relationship with Ellie. We'd known each other 2 years. We were both living in Ottawa at the time, and he called me up one day. He says, "I found this great piece of land. I'd love your feelings about it and whether or not this would be a wise investment." And it was a piece of land north of Ottawa in Quebec, about 45 minutes from Parliament Hill. And there was a couple of acres, and it was right on a lake. And so we drove up there one day to have a look at this lot that he was looking at. And it was a horrible drive on this bad dirt road for the last 20 minutes. And it was, I thought I was going to heave. It was just a terrible ride. And then suddenly we were there at this spectacular place, Lac Saint-Germain. And he showed me the spot, and that the fellow who we were going to meet, who was selling it, was a kind of a lumber baron who owned the whole lake and was dividing it up into, a small number of lots with certain conditions based on it. And I said, "Ellie, you got to buy this. This is fantastic." And it was like $18,000 for the land. Nothing on it. You'd have to build something. And $18,000 was a lot of money for guys like us at the time. But when you look back at it now, it was a drop in the bucket, really, in terms of what was possible. And he said, "I just don't know. I don't know whether Kathy, his wife, is going to like this." And I said, "Ellie, if you don't buy it, I'm going to buy it." And I ended up buying the one almost next door to it, before he'd finally come around to deciding. And we then spent summers together, watched our kids grow up together, watched our grandkids grow up together. So we had a deep friendship beyond work. So when he told me something about how I could be better at work or do a better job on a story, I never took it personally. I always took it, he's telling me that because we're friends and he wants me to be better. And so I would take the advice.
Yeah.
But I saw Ellie in a way, and you guys have seen it, David, you've seen it because you're now at the same lake. And Keith's been up there, and I don't know whether Peter ever has or not. But we saw Ellie in a different way, swimming, riding, those big tubes in the water, going to campfires, belting out, songs that you never thought that Ellie would have a clue about. But he was great. So I saw him in a different way. He
There was a big kid part of him, like he loved Disneyland.
Disneyland.
Yeah. He
loves
Disney.
He loves Zootopia.
Yeah.
Both 1 and 2. A great movie with great characters and great voices in that. Sorry. Anyway, I mean, he was, to me, as I think he was to you guys. He was not only a great leader, he was not only a great mentor, he was a great friend.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. Peter, like you dragged him into, say, Bell Canada when you were chief strategy officer there at Bell Canada. Near as I could tell, Ellie didn't know anything about business. What would he do for you in that environment? What was the point of him in that environment for you?
Yeah, well, actually, he was mostly advising Michael Sabia in that environment, and we all know where Michael Sabia's ended up. No, Ellie was one of these guys who he didn't have to know the subject matter of any particular subject. I mean, he was a very quick study. He could find what he needed to know, but it was always this sixth sense, the fact that he could listen to whatever the pitch was, whatever the issue was, and would instinctively, like a laser, go right to the weakest points in the argument and force you to reevaluate. And he didn't the strange thing was that he could deal with very technically complex issues, but he was always able to bring that extra dimension that the nerdy types didn't bring to the table. And so he could go in. I saw him in many, many different corporate environments, and he always brought the same talent, and it was a talent that every CEO, every C-suite officer needs to have before him. And Ellie just delivered that to a greater degree than anyone I've ever seen. And with me personally, I mean, he was my greatest mentor intellectually, I would have to say, and I've had a number, but none were the equivalent of Ellie.
That's quite something. Speaking of mentorship, Keith, I sort of mentioned on my podcast, the other Curse of Politics, about his role in mentoring me, and I got a very strong response to that. What was your experience, like positive response to that? What was your experience with him that way?
But he would always give you the time, right? If you needed to sort of recalibrate where you were in a story or in your career, he would give you the time to help you step back and look at it for yourself. I think that's a wonderful technique, by the way, to help you discover for yourself the answer to the thing that is what's bothering or concerning you at the moment. You know what Ellie's like? I noticed from your last podcast that you're fooling around with Claude AI. And I'm doing the same thing, but I am finding that's very close to my experiences with Ellie. And I don't want to exaggerate, his ability to cover every issue like AI does.
Yep.
But what I'm liking about Claude is that it brings a depth of analysis that I really don't think I'm capable of. And even when I think my analysis is pretty good, it goes deeper. And that just reminds me of Ellie. That's what it was like. That's why you'd stop by his office and you told him what you thought so that he could tell you what you're missing. And there was always something. And that's why you did it, because it was sometimes that thing that he added to your understanding that not only clarified it, but maybe made this, it made the story.
Yeah.
He had a wonderful talent for that. It's why people in the journalistic community still engage with Ellie right up until the end. The CBC website ran a nice piece about Ellie last weekend, or 2 weeks ago, quoting my dear friend Rob Russo. Rob never worked for Ellie,
No.
but Rob has spent a lot of time with Ellie and has a tremendous respect for him and understood the value of Ellie as a journalist when Ellie had been out of journalism for decades. He was still in touch, even though he was not an active. He was still teaching journalism at Carleton, which we haven't even touched on, and how many students whose lives he affected there. But he's somebody that the press gallery had a lot of time for. I remember being in his office one day years ago when the leader of a rival journalistic outfit with a pretty big staff called him up to ask him how he was treating the story. Or like, are you even going to do this? And Ellie gave him some time. He didn't sell out the CBC on the phone to a rival, but he got off the phone and he was sort of almost whimsical. He says, like, I wonder what it's like to feel that insecure about a story. And I'm thinking, I bet you do wonder. But I think there are a lot of insights into Ellie in those stories. I'll give you just one last one. When I first started at the Bureau, I learned very quickly that you can take a message on the phone for anybody but Ellie's kids. If Ellie's kids call, put Ellie on the phone. He may be on the phone, tell him it's his kids. But they get priority over everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. On that journalism thing, I kind of want to end on this note, Peter Mansbridge, which is, when I think about all the people, whether it's Rob or Rosie Barton, who said, geez, I heard from Ellie a lot, commenting, sometimes not positively, sometimes encouragingly about what I was doing. And I think about the hundreds and hundreds of journalism students he taught at Queen's and Carleton. I look at a media environment that's far from ideal and far from what you worked in. And I wonder whether there's any hope, any legacy of Ellie that we can look to maybe as a hope. Maybe do you think that somehow there's people out there that still understand what a public broadcaster ought to do and are going to bring those ethics to, or what journalism ought to be, and are going to bring those ethics to the work that they do going forward?
Well, I think part of the legacy is exactly what you just said. It was that Ellie taught and influenced generations of journalists, hundreds of them. And some of them didn't stay with journalism. They went into consulting and public affairs, and they took the lessons, though, that they learned from Elly Alboim.
Yeah.
And they're using them in those fields as well. And so that's part of the legacy. So that's good. Listen, journalism is in a challenging time right now. Some of us old guys like to think, the golden days, it was so much better. Well, they weren't all golden. There were a few problems in those days too. But there are challenges right now. And going to the Ellie handbook of how to deal with them is important. He'd been on my podcast a number of times in the last few years, and it always came around to that. Like, what are we missing?
Yeah.
What are journalists today missing?
Yeah.
And he would always have wise counsel on that. He'd talk about what was needed, more transparency on the part of journalism and journalists about the way they do the job, more sourcing, better sourcing. There's a tendency to slide these days into unnamed sources, a lot more than there ever used to be in our day. And I understand the reason for some of that, but it also troubles me. I'd rather see a name attached to something than some source, because as Ellie used to say, when they're not willing to give you their name, there's probably a reason for that should be in your story.
Right.
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 Anyway, I trust that his legacy is going to be all those people who he had influence on, whether it was at university or whether, as Keith said, still talking to journalists about their profession long after they'd been at school or had been taught by him or not.
Keith, thoughts on Ellie legacy?
I mean, I think, I would have said the same thing that Peter does. He cared a lot about young people. He loved teaching at Carleton. He really loved it. He loved being able to influence those young minds and find out what they were thinking now and how they were changing. It was hugely important to him. I mean, there was a sense that he wanted to give something back, and that's not unimportant. But he enjoyed the giving back part.
Also a defined benefit pension.
Well, there was that.
Ellie was cautious. Ellie was cautious about money.
Deep humanity, I mean, he was teaching people to not lose their humanity in this, because it's not hard to do in journalism. Journalism does attract cynics and produce cynics, and we talked a bit about Ellie. I did not find Ellie cynical in himself, but I found, as I said before, he had a keen eye for it, and I think enjoyed that part of the political game, because there's quite a bit of cynicism attached to often ambition in politics and so on. And he liked that part of the show. But I didn't find him a cynical person myself, and maybe I'm being naive about it, because I adored Ellie as a boss. I mean, he really did care about the people. He stood by his people. He taught them a lot, and he never asked you to do anything that he wouldn't do himself.
Yeah.
Peter, we're going to have Nicholson. We're going to have a call tomorrow morning of a group of people that have been getting on the phone together on a Zoom call every couple of weeks for a decade now to chew over the fat. And Ellie is not going to be there.
I think he'll be there. He's there in all of you.
Yeah, well, that's the point of the legacy, Peter, certainly for us and for those of us who knew him, and because of all the students that he has mentored and educated over the years, that cohort is going to live on. And I would say the same for countless public servants and politicians who have taken his advice. So the Ellie that we've all been describing today certainly didn't pass away 2 weeks ago. And I think the one thing that I'd want to close with, and it's implicit, I guess, in everything we've said, we've been describing such a great man, and yet he was such a modest man. I think I referred a number of times to the fact that his ego was always under control, but you couldn't be in Ellie's presence recognizing what a remarkable intellect and individual he was, and not be struck by how modest the man was. And I think that modesty is one of the reasons why he could, again, tell you not what you wanted to hear, but what you needed to hear, and took no offense from it.
Right. I really agree. Listen, thanks so much, you three. And thank you to everybody out there who watched or listened to this program. Listen to the four of us talk about a man that we loved a lot and who meant a lot to the country. Special show for me to do, and three very special people for me to do it with. So enormously grateful to you. And I'm going to sign off before I start to cry a little bit here. To all of our sponsors, thank you, and to all of you Herle Burly-ites who watch or listen, appreciate it. We'll see you next week with more stuff. Peter, Keith, thank you.
Herle Burly.